Okay. Alrighty. Okay. Ow. All right. Sorry. I'm having a little trouble getting my head in the game. The department, for reasons I don't understand, decided to have their fall welcome today from 12 to 1:30 at the university club. So I have to run over there between my other class and this one, and then be like, okay, well, I gotta go, bye, and run all the way back here. So now I'm like feeling frazzled. Okay. I'm a delicate creature. I'm just gonna throw it out there. Just the tiniest bit of stress and I fall apart. All right, so obviously last time we had some problems with the tech. Oh, good. I've learned which switch does what. I'm very smart. So posted the lecture online, and you should have all been able to find it. Good? Okay. So today we're going to kind of pick up last couple slides in talking about research design, and then we're going to go on and talk about research ethics. So very quick reminder that tomorrow is your first lab, right? So the first lab, you have it either at 9 or is it at 1? 2, okay, 2, sorry. I don't teach them, so I don't care. No, I'm kidding. And again, if you need to switch between them, right, they're in the same room that is the room next door here, B38. So if you need to, you can't make the 9 o'clock one for whatever reason, but you're scheduled in that one, but you can make the 2 o'clock one, feel free to go to the one at 2, right? L'Oreal won't be keeping attendance or anything, so, it's there for you, and use it, for what it is and to the best of your ability. Okay, any questions before I jump in? Yeah.
Is there anything that we need to bring? Should we bring our laptop or just what we would normally bring to class?
Yeah, just what you would normally bring to class, right? So if you're a notebook, you have a Surface, so just bring your Surface, it'll be good. But yeah, nothing specialized, and we're not running any special software because we're not doing statistics or anything like that. So yeah, just yourself and whatever tools you need. And yeah, any other questions? Nay, going once, going twice. Gone. Okay, so. Oh, you have a question? I'm sorry, I thought I looked at you and then. Oh, I see. You tricked me. Technically, I already said gone, so your question. No, go ahead. I would say probably about an hour and a half, typically, right? So I would doubt it'll last the full 2 hours, right? So, yeah, it's not as content heavy as it was in the past, I think, and there's still some debate as to what the labs are there for. Some other people who teach the course have only 1 or 2 labs during the term, but I have 6. But yeah, it'll probably be about an hour and a half, typically based on experience. So, yeah.
Should we have a research question in mind for Thursday?
No, you don't have to. You're going to work through in some group work, kind of coming up with research questions. And then your kind of mini lab assignment, which will be due on Sunday at midnight, if I'm not mistaken about the schedule I myself created, but don't know at all because I keep having to look at it. Then you'll have to have your research question ready for then. And again, don't worry with the mini lab about quote unquote doing it wrong. It doesn't. You're going to get feedback on it, and the grade for it is did you do it, right? And if you did it, hopefully do a good job because it'll build towards your bigger assignment. But let's say you slap it together with 10 minutes left to go and you're really not happy with it. You'll still get the grade and you'll still get feedback. So don't be stressed out about like, am I doing this right? Because maybe not, but it's there so you get feedback before you get like formally evaluated on it. So, and that's for, I'm talking directly to you, but that's for everybody, right? Like, I know assignments come with a lot of anxiety, but this one shouldn't, because if you did it, you get the grade and you get feedback so that you can then improve for the one that you're going to get kind of, a more formal grade of like, 5 out of 5 or 4 out of 5 or whatever it happens to be. But does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Other questions? No? I really should have rented one of those electric scooters and scootered back here, come down the stairs into the building. And I feel like that would be frowned on. Okay. All right. Okay. Are we good to jump into content? We honestly have like 3 slides left in this slideshow, and we're going to switch over to the next one. Okay. So I guess we, last time you ended off, just talking about different kinds of design, and obviously you had recording. Oh, that was from last time. Your cross-sectional designs, right, where you're essentially looking at a similar kind of set of questions, but with completely different groups, right? So there's that. And then longitudinal designs, right, where you're following the same group at different stages, right? And I mean, we've had some cool ones in the department, one that's still running that started in like the 1970s, where they followed the same group of people, and I think they do the survey every 5 years, right? So they follow them and get new information on the same group over time. And the group's gotten smaller over time, obviously, because you have these different kinds of attrition. Okay. Anyway, yeah, so drawbacks. People leave and people die. You lose track of people. Anyway, we talked about that last time. I will go back over it because you can just rewatch the video. Okay, another type of kind of research study design you could do is what's called case study design. And basically, a case study is just an in-depth study of a single case. And a case can be anything virtually, right? Person, family, organization, event, country, province, city, workplace. It could be just about anything, right? So you could do, you want to do a case study of super successful professors in the Department of Sociology. So you would not pick me. You would pick my boss, Sandra Brusarius, right? There you go. That could be a case study of a super successful German professor. A family, right? You could look at any family. Organizations, right? Anything from like a religious organization, a company, a fan club, right? Anything, if such a thing still exists, anything you want, right? You could do, for an event, if you want to go to the Edmonton Expo, right, and look at people in cosplay costumes, right, that could be a case study. You could do a case study of that particular event. The Edmonton Furry Con, which I'm convinced is a thing, though I've never even bothered to look it up. That could be that, or, you could look at a case study of, say, Canada or anything, right? So you can do a television network, you can do all sorts of things as case studies. But basically, in a case study, you're going to be looking in great detail at that one particular thing, contextualizing, the heck out of it, right? So you're going to be giving really rich, like history, context, information about that particular case, as much as you can possibly kind of muster. And it can be, qualitative, a lot of case studies are, or quantitative, or a mix of both, right? So lots of times, like a case study, so let's say you're doing American teenagers, or people in the US age 13 to 25, right? You could do surveys with them, or you could do survey or interviews with them, or you could do surveys and interviews, right? So you could mix all of that into a case study of, that particular group, right? And maybe I should write group, because groups or cohorts could be case studies as well, or cohort, right? All of these things can be case studies. Okay, does that all make sense? I know, thrilling stuff. Yeah, I mean, like with a lot of, especially qualitative research, sometimes you can run into questions with case studies as to the validity of, like the external validity of the case study, right? Are the findings generalizable, or are they just particular to that case? Now, even if they're not, that doesn't mean that the case study is not worth doing, right? Or the study's not worth doing. It just might mean that you can't actually, say, oh, I studied Russian TV, so Chinese TV must work exactly the same, right? That's not necessarily evident, but, sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a second. It's not evident that your findings on one would be generalizable to the other. That doesn't mean the case study is not worth doing. It just, external validity tends to be one particular weakness of a case study, right? And if you were looking, say, at teenagers in Edmonton, right, or students in Edmonton public schools, it would not necessarily be the case that you could say, well, this applies nationally to Canada, because it would be, maybe Quebec is different. Oh, Quebec's definitely different. Or Ontario, the Maritimes, right? They'd all be a little bit different in their history, context, socioeconomics, and all of that stuff. So they might not be generalizable, but external validity isn't always the point. Okay, and case studies have other strengths, right? Particularly the in-depth description of the characteristics of a particular case, right? That can't be achieved using other methods. You're digging in really deep to that particular case and giving a lot of detail. So whether it's generalizable or not, you're getting a lot of detail about that particular thing and learning about that particular instance. Again, whether it be a person, a country, or whatever, right? And there's no real rule for how big the scale of a case study can be. So does that make sense? Okay. All right. Okay, one slide. I thought I had three. I have four. All right, so 3 types of cases. The critical case, right? So the critical case, basically, it says here, illustrates the conditions under which a certain hypothesis holds or does not hold. Basically, the critical case would be the one that you kind of hang your hat on, right? It's critical because it is the one that basically proves or disproves a particular hypothesis. So, so if you say we're looking at different types of therapy, right? And let's say you were talking about, you did maybe as a part of a study, you had 5 case studies of people using different types of therapy, right? Let's say talk therapy. So you had, and basically, your critical case there would be, say, the person using cognitive behavioral therapy, right? And then you say, okay, well, based on, these different cases, this person was using exposure therapy, which I guess technically is a kind of cognitive behavioral therapy sometimes. Anyway, I'm not a psychologist because I loathe them. But, let's say you had one person and what you said is, hey, they saw, this huge improvement in their level of generalized anxiety by doing cognitive behavioral therapy. That person becomes your critical case, right? And basically saying, okay, this is the kind of technique that works. Or, you could have lots of things in terms of a critical case. It really depends on what you are studying. But the critical one is the one that, say, really sort of is the one you hinge your whole conclusions on. Does that make sense? Okay. The extreme or unique case. The extreme or unique case are basically the ones, kind of the exceptions to the rule, right? Which sometimes helps you understand the more common ones. These would be, either, let's say, cases that end up really successful, let's say using cognitive behavioral therapy. Maybe the one that was using it and was really unsuccessful, but helps you understand, maybe they were resistant to CBT. But it helps you understand, say, why the more common ones were successful, right? So you look at it, they're unusual in that, say, most people cooperate with their therapist, this person doesn't. And so in that extreme case, you see why these techniques work in certain circumstances. Does that make sense? Okay, I see nods. Anyone nodding no? Everyone nod yet? No, I'm kidding. All right, and the revelatory case examines a case or context never before studied, right? So this is, something totally new, something that was maybe inaccessible in the past. The study of particular historical figures, the opening of an archive, let's say, I don't know, like after the end of the Cold War, when people went into, say, the KGB archives in Moscow, or the Stasi archives in East Berlin, right? Those are the secret services of the Soviet Union and East Germany, and look at things like documents that are declassified, right? So, and then find new information that you didn't know before because information wasn't available, right? So those would be revelatory cases, right? Something that's never been studied before. If you can, again, come up with something that's just never been studied, you could call that a revelatory case as well, right? So if you discover a totally new approach to looking at something, that could be a revelatory case as well. Okay, does that make sense? All right, they're pretty simple. Okay, I won't talk about this, but this is just kind of a review of all of this, right? These different kinds of designs that we could talk about. As you're designing your own major labs, right? You can reference back to this to kind of see. One thing I usually say, and I didn't get a chance because of the projector failure, so I'll just mention it now. When you're kind of coming up with your little project that you're going to write up for, the mini labs and then the major lab, one thing I'll say is just be careful about experimental design. And I would actually suggest, for the purposes of this class, and again, I don't want to say experimental designs don't work, but for the purposes of this class, it's really difficult to sort of follow the rubric that I'm looking for using an experimental design. And very specifically, excuse me, I'm gonna sneeze. Fight it. I've won, I think. Okay. When it asks you for, bless you, sample research materials, I passed it on to you. That's what I did. I transmuted my sneeze to someone else. When you have to create research, sample research materials, and that's one of the things, this is a really, really difficult one to do that for, right? Just because, it's just going to be really difficult for you to conceive of some kind of social experiment and then create research materials. So what almost always happens is if people choose like an experimental design, I will warn you when you submit your research question. I'm like, okay, you may run into this pitfall later on in my notes. When people come to that part of the assignment where they have to produce sample research materials, it becomes really difficult. My honest to God suggestion is to stick to surveys for that because they're the best. But just as you're kind of thinking through this first lab, I will say maybe stay away from experimental design. I know they're fun to think about because you're like, I'm going to put 5 of my classmates in a box, all with buttons, and they're going to shock each other, and we'll see how they react. My 5 least favorite classmates, I hope. But it is going to be hard for you to come up with sample research materials. So because I want you to do well on those assignments, surveys are usually the easiest one to go with. Not that surveys are easy to write, but we'll work on that together. Okay, so I just wanted to give you that warning because I, don't know that I did before. Okay. Any questions before I close out research design and move on to the most thrilling of all topics, research ethics? Going once? No, no, you're good. I'm just kidding. I'm joking. All right. But see, now if you want to ask questions about something in the slides, I'll have to reopen them, and that's going to be very awkward. Okay. Oh, okay, next one. Research ethics. Super fun. Okay, so research ethics. You don't see anything. I don't know why, every time I close PowerPoint and it's connected to these projectors, it like switches back to so only the PC screen is on. I don't know why it does this. Ta-da! There we go. It's not hard to fix, but must be a setting I have set wrong. All right, so research ethics, now you see the words. Obviously ethics are really, really important. It's one of those things that can easily get glossed over, but any experiment, and I'll say every experiment, or every study, whether it's experimental, survey, interviews, ethnography, participant observation, structured observation, right? Anything other than a few qualitative methods that are entirely textual, so you're just looking at documents, are going to require research ethics, in sociology. So it's a really, I guess the other thing, using someone else's data doesn't require ethics, but anything where you're doing original research with human beings is going to require ethics approval. So what does that look like? Okay. Now, so what do we need to think about? Research ethics needs to be addressed in the initial stages of a study, right? So right at the beginning, when you're thinking about your research design, you have to be thinking about ethics as well. And I mean, I'll put it this way. You can't start talking to people, say doing interviews or sample interviews, as we get into other things, right? We'll talk about pilot studies, right? Where you might want to have a survey and you want to test out the questions to see if they work. So you run a little pilot study. You can't do any of that without ethics approval, right? So the basic stages, you need ethics approval. Like my supervisor, when I was doing my PhD, who, by the way, was not a good supervisor. I don't know if I've told you that. But she was not. But one good thing that she did is before I started doing anything, she's like, we're going to apply for research ethics. You're going to come up with a proposal that has you, interviewing like 10 people. And we're going to do that so that if you talk to 10 people, you already have that research ethics set up, and you can just add people on. If you want to talk to more than 10 people, like you want to go 20 or 30 or 40, you just go and do a revision to the research ethics. Because the thing is, I was flying off to Moscow. It's a long story. To basically attend a conference on Russian TV. And my supervisor was like, if you end up just having a chance to interview some people, you probably just want to have it, because if you don't, you're going to get into trouble, which is exactly what ended up happening. I ended up interviewing 2 people while I was there that I just met there, and it was a lucky thing I had research ethics, right? So you need to be thinking about the ethics of your study from day one, right? As you're writing your research proposal, if you're proposing your master's thesis, if you're going to be talking or interacting with human beings in any way, you need to start here. Now, that said, you also need to think about it all the way through your study, right? The safety and the health and wellness of your participants needs to be fundamental in your mind all the way through, even like 10 years after you've finished a project and you're still mining that sweet, sweet data for publications and you've made your career on that project. You still need to make sure that you are in alignment with research ethics standards, right? So that you're not doing something like exposing personal details, saying things you shouldn't, giving the data out in ways that might be harmful to your participants, right? So I know this is kind of like medicine, but the same applies in research ethics, right? Primum non nocere, first, do no harm, right? So the goal is not to harm your participants, right? Or at least, if there is a potential for harm, you have to have things like informed consent. But right, your first priority as a researcher is to ensure that people being studied are not harmed by their participation. Okay. You might think that your study is really important, right? And that the knowledge that you are going to gain, and I'm not saying maybe you're not psychopaths. There certainly have been psychopaths in academia, which is why we now have these rules. We'll talk about that in a sec. The reason we have this at the top, I scribbled over my thing. I'm sad now. Okay, we'll try that again. The reason we have this top statement, right? Knowledge is of secondary interest to participant safety. Sometimes academics get tunnel vision, right? I guess this is true of anybody, but sometimes academics get tunnel vision. And they are of the view that, okay, maybe people will get harmed by this study, but, and what would be the justification? It's worth it, right? Or you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs, right? That the knowledge that you get out of a study is going to be so valuable and so revolutionary. That was never the case with my studies, but okay. But certainly I know people who've thought these kinds of things, right? It's going to be so important that it's worth it even if people are harmed, right? That the knowledge you're going to get out of it is worth potentially harming people. That doesn't work, right? Knowledge and what you could learn has to be secondary to the well-being of your participants. And this is, unfortunately, academics in the past have tread too close to this line and on the other side of it and had this exact attitude that basically the knowledge was going to be worth it at the end of the day. And one of the very famous examples of this is and it's in medicine, but it applies across, is what are called the Tuskegee syphilis study, right? And basically, these researchers in the US wanted to better understand the long-term effects of syphilis, right? And they were like, yeah, once we know more about what it does to you long-term, we'll have this knowledge and it'll be worth it, right? We'll learn so much and we can help people with long-term syphilis from knowing this. So they found a bunch of men, mostly, African-American who had syphilis, and they basically said, okay, we're going to give you treatment for your syphilis, right? Because syphilis is pretty curable. But instead they gave them a placebo, and then they followed them for decades. It was actually like 30 years that this study ran before someone looked at it and was like, I'm sorry, you're doing what? And they let these people suffer with, syphilis, thinking that they had been treated, for decades. Again, the justification was, we'll learn so much. Imagine what we could learn about the long-term effects of syphilis. This is why this rule exists. It's like, even if you think and again, you're all lovely, charming people, and none of you are going to infect anyone with syphilis and watch them for 30 years, right? That's not going to happen. You're all, better than that, I hope. Right? Okay. just checking. So none of you are going to walk that line, but that's why this rule and this kind of principle is there, right? Because people will cross that line and people get tunnel vision, right? Because sometimes you're so in on your study that you can't see the wider world around you. Okay, so risk assessment, key feature of all research now. And here, increasingly, by the way, this is true of risk assessment to you as a researcher as well, but mostly to the participants. I can tell we have some wild stories now because anytime we do research now, we have to have a field action plan where basically you outline all of the possible risks. And at the CCR, we've sometimes joked a little bit about it because some of the things are, we are driving to the prison to interview people. We might get into a traffic accident. There might be rain. We could slip on the ice and hit our heads. So one of our junior researchers came out wearing her climbing helmet so that she could have it while she crossed the parking lot in case she slipped and hit her head. So risk assessment now increasingly includes the researcher as well. And 100% some of the stuff that I did during my PhD, flying to Russia, would probably, not pass muster. Well, anyway, not today anyway. So, yeah, so you have to always balance, anyway, potential gain with risks and harm. And like I said, increasingly, especially at U of A, this is now including the researcher. This is all anthropology's fault, by the way, because tragically, one of their researchers fell through a glacier and died. And now it's like, okay, now we have to assess risks. Super silly. I'm not going to fall through a glacier. Other things might happen, though. All right. Anyway. So typically ethics in Canada is going to be covered by the Tri-Policy Ethical Conduct, Tri-Policy Statement for Ethical Conduct for Research Involving Humans, or TICPS 2. Sorry, some acronyms are not meant to be said out loud. TICPS 2. Okay, so and this governs the three big granting agencies in Canada. SSHRC, right, the Social Sciences Humanities Research Council, the CIHR, the Canadian Institute for Health Research, and NSERC, the National Science and Engineering Research Council. And yeah, trust me, like once you go into like masters and PhDs, you're gonna be talking, to one of these two probably, unless you go into medicine all the time and constantly begging them for money. All of this has any study you propose is administered through the research ethics boards of your home university, right? So SSHRC, CIHR, and NSERC don't have their own research ethics boards. It's governed by your university's research ethics board. And the approval process can be long. Sorry, I'm giggling because as I say that, Sandra, who I love, and like I said, she's some kind of dark wizard of academic research, because she was proposing this like massive prison study. We're going to be talking to 1,100 people who are on the day of their release and following up with them. And she got her approval. Can you guess how long it took? In 12 hours. And I'm like, I don't even understand this study, and I'm part of it, sort of. And you got approval for this insane, massive scale study in 12 hours. I honestly think she like sold her soul for academic superpowers. It's madness. Anyway, 12 hours. Yeah, she's like, yeah, this could take a while. We better submit this early. And then the next day she's like, well, we got research approval. I'm like, I don't understand what is happening here. When I did the two kind of studies I've done where I had human participants, one of them took a week and the other one took a month to get ethics approval. That said, right, as you're stepping on the plane to, you should not put in your research ethics application as you're stepping on the plane or into your car to go interview a participant, because it can take time depending on what you're doing. I've seen people had to go back and forth with the ethics board 2 or 3 times, right? It took a couple of months to get research ethics approval. So you want to make sure that you have it well in advance and not be waiting. And I've seen people nervously being like, I'm supposed to go into the field in 6 days and I still don't have ethics. And usually it works out, but you don't want to be having to reschedule stuff or cancel stuff or lie. Never do that. It's a terrible idea. If you get caught, you can get booted for ethics violations. So you want to apply for this well before you plan to start your research ethics, your research study. Okay. The Research Ethics Board. So the policy is due to, this tri-council policy is due to inadvertent harm caused to participants, or sometimes advertent harms caused to participants. After, it's not just Tuskegee, there's been a bunch of studies, like Stanford Prison Experiment, right, was another one. There's been lots of examples historically of people putting their participants in situations that were potentially harmful, and therefore, basically a filter has been put between the researcher and ethics, right? Someone who can, or a group of people who can judge the ethics of a project and maybe see potential risks that the researcher might not have considered or might be purposely ignoring because it, doesn't suit their purposes. Not that anyone's like that, but yeah. So basically the Research Ethics Board, or REB, is there to, help you recognize risks you might not see and, help us mitigate the long history of unethical research that led to the creation of research ethics boards in the first place. And again, there's lots of it. It's not just a few instances. Unethical research, sadly, used to be pretty widespread, especially in psychology. No, I'm kidding. But yes, actually in psychology, there's, that one that you always hear about in intro psychology where they had one person sitting in a room and thinking they were shocking some person almost to death. Definitely not ethical by today's standards. And it's stuff like this where it's like, well, let's just see how long they keep pushing the button. If they think the person on the other side of the glass is dead, maybe they'll stop. And the person is like deeply traumatized because they think they killed someone. Bad. Don't do that. to keep things like that from happening, it helps to have a few other sets of eyes on your research project. Okay, all Canadian research at universities, anyway, requires Research Ethics Board approval. This is not always, so if you end up venturing into the private sector, right, because I don't know, you like money, I strongly recommend money. It's very nice. Which is why I'm an academic, because, you know, all them bucks. Not so much. I'll put it this way. You can look up my name on the university's sunshine list, and I am not there because I don't make enough money to show up as one of the people who makes over 150 grand a year. So I don't know what's that's worth to you, but I don't make that much. However, you can look up my boss and see how much she makes, or the former chair of the department and see how much he makes. It's fun. I didn't even know this existed until apparently on July 1st, all the academics start looking up each other's salaries. And my boss was like, have you seen what da-da-da makes? And I'm like, how would I know that? She's like, go to this website. And I'm like, it's a lot of money. Oh, anyway, it's good times. I don't know why I told you that. But seriously, July 1st, super fun day. It's like free agency day in hockey, except it's what did your colleague or that person you hate in the department make this year? Okay, so research ethics. So yeah, I mean, private institutions, right? So if you go to like work for like a Leger or an Abacus Data or a marketing firm, right? They do a lot of stuff with people. They don't require research ethics boards. Sometimes they might have an internal research ethics board or a ethics kind of person, but typically the private sector operates a little bit differently. Any university or research institute kind of study in Canada that gets any kind of federal funding requires Research Ethics Board approval, right? And typically through universities. Yes, you must obtain it. I'm going to put 2 arrows, one on each side, before people are approached to be participants, right? And I mean, increasingly people are getting really good about asking for pro numbers, right? And the pro number at U of A is your research ethics approval. You know, when I did it, you can probably still find it on the U Alberta Reddit, actually. I was looking for people in Edmonton to interview for focus groups. And, you know, I posted on the U Alberta Reddit, and people were like, we're taking this down until you provide a pro number, which I was like, oops, here it is. And then they reposted it, right? But yeah, you have to have that before you start recruiting, right? So you can't recruit and then get it. Bad ethics. You can't begin your research, no matter how cool you think it is, until you've obtained full ethics clearance from your institution. So yeah, no pilot studies, no preliminary interviews, unless it's your mom, right? You can like be like, I have this survey and I want to see if the questions work. Mom, can you take my survey? That's fine as long as you're not going to use the data. But if you're going to do a pilot study, and we'll talk about why you would in a little bit, research ethics you have to have. And yeah, I mean, unless you are like my boss and you've sacrificed a goat to the dark gods of academic success, research ethics has a couple of things they can do. The most common one, honestly, because we're academics and we're niggly about stuff, is you require modifications, right? They can approve it straight out. That's pretty rare, because usually they're going to ask you a few questions at least. They can approve it straight out. They can reject a study, which again is pretty rare. You'd have to be proposing something wildly dark and unethical for them to just flat out reject you. The most common one is they require modifications. So like, okay, have you thought of this? How are you going to address this, right? What if you have participants with disabilities, right? What if you have participants with trauma? How are you going to address that, right? All of those things. My favorite thing when I was doing my first one was I was talking to like TV executives in Russia and Europe, and they were like, so what if you find yourself in a power imbalance? And I'm like, these are all executives making like 6-figure salaries or 7-figure salaries. If they don't want to talk to me, they'll just tell me to fuck off. And that's actually what I wrote back to the Research Ethics Board. And I was told to fuck off quite a few times. So, there's that. And weirdly, the Research Ethics Board actually accepted that. So there you go. I'm not always the most diplomatic person. So usually it's like the last questions. They'll require a modification. They'll say, what if this happens? Have you considered your own safety? No. I'm going to climb down that glacial falaise and hope for the best. But yeah, basically, these are the 3 steps. And there is an appeal process if they go right to the rejection, right? Because sometimes things happen. For instance, you're never supposed to, if they're all anonymized, right? So you don't know who you're reviewing. You might know like what faculty your reviewers are from. Like when I did my last one of the people was from the Faculty of Nursing, but it didn't say their name, right? I didn't have their actual name, and they're not supposed to know who you are. But, universities are small places, and sometimes people can guess who you are by the kind of study that you're doing. And sometimes you have enemies, and they might torpedo your study. I'm not saying that has ever happened, but I 100% know of at least 2 cases where the person on the research ethics board 100% knew who was applying and just hated that person's guts and was like, yeah, no, rejected. So there is a process where you get to say, I think there might be something wrong with this research ethics board. Could I submit it to a different ethics board and see if I get a different outcome? I'm not going to say that academics are petty. I will let you draw your own conclusions about academics. But yeah, I mean, sometimes stuff happens, right? And universities are small places, right? I mean, there's 55,000 people at the U of A, not that many professors. So you typically you can get a sense of sometimes who you are and who's applying. And, even you're not supposed to be reviewed by anyone in your own department or sometimes your own faculty, depending on the research ethics board. But sometimes, say, someone in education might know who you are and really hate you and try to shoot down your research ethics application. So again, I'm not saying that would ever happen. It 100% does, though. So there's always an appeal process if you think your application has been unfairly judged. If you think maybe that the person judging it didn't have the expertise, because one of the other things is there is always at least one person from a totally random faculty, right? So there's always someone who should be a non-expert in the field, right? So not someone from a social science, judging social science research. So a doctor, usually it's like a doctor, a nurse, an engineer, or something like that, so that you have an outside set of eyes that might see things, from outside the discipline. Okay, that's a lot of doodling. All right. Yes. So, yeah, universities, colleges, private companies, yeah, you can find some private companies do have research ethics boards. Like I said, sometimes they have a compliance officer or an ethics compliance officer. Different companies will do things in different ways. It depends on what kind of work they're doing. Biomedical almost always will have a research ethics board. If they're a pharmaceutical company doing research, there's a research ethics board that they're accountable to. But on the social science side, marketing, polling, and these sorts of things, it's usually not a whole ethics board. It's usually more just like a set of eyes, an ethicist who looks at it. Members typically from different disciplines, right? Again, this is to avoid wow, that would be really cool if we knew that, right? We're all doctors, and I've always wondered about that. We should really do this research that involves cutting people's legs off, because it would be really cool to know what happens, or, that's not a real thing, or, infect people with syphilis or whatever it happens to be. Okay, I'm misstating that. They were already infected with syphilis. They just didn't treat it. So you have people from different disciplines to avoid the shiny factor, right? So you want someone, from sociology judging medical research, or from engineering, right, to say, that actually sounds pretty terrible. So, and you must have external representation, right? So there's usually someone either from outside the university or from, very much arm's length, like a discipline so far outside of what you're doing that is on the research ethics board, again, to stop that kind of like shiny factor. Okay. Conflict of interest rules, funding relationships, right? So they can't be potentially funded by these. If it's something like SHRC, it's typically fine, right? Because SHRC is arm's length anyway. But let's say, what would be a evil corporation? Any of them? No, Google. Let's say Google, right? So let's say, I am funded by Google. So I'm going to put a big G. That said, I have a Google phone, but whatever. I've given into the darkness. I have a Google phone. I'm sorry, I'm funded by Google, and this other person is applying for a research grant that's also funded by Google. I would have to recuse myself from that ethics panel, right? Because there's the conflict of interest that maybe, I don't remember who runs Google anymore, Satan. I can't remember. Maybe Satan is going to lean on me and be like, hey, I could, we're giving you money. Could you just, approve that application? That'd be great, right? So if you're funded by the same, especially corporate organization, they're going to want to see, you're going to want to recuse yourself to avoid any potential conflict of interest. Working with the applicant, right? So and this is really weirdly strict, right? So it's stuff like if you've ever collaborated on a project, you can't review that person's application, right? And you know who it is. And typically this is done through your CV, right? So you have like a list of people you've worked with and publications. So if you ever worked with that person, if you've co-published an article with them or book in the last 10 years, you cannot review their ethics application. If you hate them, however, and want to see their ultimate downfall, that apparently is perfectly ethical. But yeah, and there's all sorts of really weird rules. But yeah, it's up to like 10 years that you can't have actually worked directly with an applicant. And typically, like I said, they're going to compare your CVs and be like, oh, you both published articles in this collected volume. Okay, we're going to take you off that research ethics board. So always conflict of interest. And like with funding relationships, right, on my application, I would be like, hey, this research project is being funded by Google. And then, I would be like, oh, I'm also being funded by Google. I can't review this application. Again, we want to minimize conflicts of interest, and especially, big corporations that might have an interest in funding research and maybe, leaning on someone to be like, hey, approve this because we really want to find this out. You want to minimize that as much as possible. Okay. I can say this really quickly. Ethics approval for quantitative research. Typically, it is a little bit easier to get your ethics approval for quantitative research. For one, it tends to be a little bit more hands-off, right? So the most typical quantitative work is survey research. And yes, technically you're dealing with human participants, but the chances, A, that you're going to traumatize them with a survey question, I can do it, but I don't want to. But you'd have to work really hard to traumatize someone with a survey question. I saw that look, you're like, how would you traumatize someone with a survey question? Cleverly. So typically that's the most common quantitative method. So it's hard to traumatize someone or cause harm with surveys, generally speaking. So it's typically a lot easier. And, you have a stated hypothesis and a specific plan for testing. With qualitative research, because it's iterative, right? Because you're doing like a grounded theory and you're not maybe sure what step 2 of your grounded theory is going to be, it can be a little bit tougher to get a research ethics board to sign off. And so yeah, some research ethics boards favor quantitative work because A, you're more at arm's length and it's considered to be a little bit more scientific. Okay, we have 1 minute left, but I'm not going to do another slide in 1 minute. So why don't we leave it there? We'll come back on Friday. We'll keep going. We have so much ethics to do. It'll be great. All right.